All right, Ali, I'm going to pick a word out of this can of words. And if you'd like, you can define it or talk about it. Would you like to participate?
Sure, I do. That's fine. Sure.
Okay. I think I picked a good one for you. So the word is consciousness.
Jesus, David.
That's a, that's a big one. That's a big one. You can
uh,
pass. You can
no,
pass, and I can pick another one for you if you want.
no, that's okay. That's the one I have a lot of difficulties with.
Yeah.
Maybe we have engaged before in this, but
The whole scientific community hasn't agreed on
well,
that.
right. So no, I can give you my definition actually, which is kind of the definition I think is verbatim from what I've learned.
Yeah,
It
that
is,
should kick us off.
yeah, and it is basically the the sentient internal awareness of internal and external input type thing. So that's kind of the most basic form, basic definition that just about everybody agrees on. And beyond that, then of course, as David, as you know, there are probably 10,000 different definitions, and
Yeah.
everybody and their brothers they have thought about it. Anyway, that was fun actually selecting that word for me because I have a lot of difficulties with it. I just
Yeah.
yeah, so
So it's
so that's
the awareness of inputs.
of external and input, external and internal kind of input,
Mhm.
and the awareness, yeah, of the
Okay.
internal and external input. That's actually, if you look it up, and I'm not doing that right now. I've done this several times, and that's the basic definition that has been given. That just about everybody agrees on that basic, really pretty dry and almost pretty ordinary definition. But beyond that, then the field becomes filled up with 10,000 books and probably a million opinions and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. This is one of those words where if you ask 10 people, you'll get 11 answers. uh, what what would be an example of an input in this context?
Input I actually put would be anything like, and by the way, this is not limited to humans. Even in insect, they get certain input of vibration and probably heat and some level of, maybe sound and some level of colors, they get all of that. That's how they interact, with their environment. And the input would be, that's kind of external input. And then internal input is the stuff that the body does in reacting to either just to survive digestions and pain and things and emotional kind of input, qualia that we get in our head. So those are kind of internal things. But there's always an interaction. It seems to me that it has to be that way. But um, anyway,
Like
that's the
sun,
example.
yeah, like sunlight would be an external input and fear would be an internal input.
Yeah, let me think about that. Fear would be you get a sensation of that which is internal. We're reacting to an external kind of signal of some kind. But yeah, that would be kind of internal. And I think that's what I'm just thinking as you were asking the question is it always appears to be interaction is going on. Even, for example, the signals you may get from your stomach, let's say, you make a noise, the digestion is just, it's interacting with what is being taken in as food. And I'm just trying to think if there is any internal input that is completely void of any kind of external interaction. Um, I'll just think about it because I don't have an example right now. Even our thoughts are, and it's somehow reflecting to something, either biological or environmental, and that kind of will come up with these thoughts. So anyway, I'll just, a good question, David. I'll just hold on to this. Come up with
Anybody
something.
else want to chime in about consciousness?
Um, the way I resolve this and the whole notion of what Ali was saying about external, internal,
Hmm.
is the spectrum of things. The good old Alfonsoism of the spectrum of things.
The spectrum of consciousness.
Yeah. So you have very basic life forms that interact with the environment, and they get more and more complex as organisms uh, develop a nervous system, a brain, senses, all the different inputs and outputs that we call sensory inputs. Um, and so that's one of the spectrums of things. One of the you know ways of addressing consciousness, because I think people say, no, you know what, something that interacts with something else is conscious, and they go, I don't know if you were there, but we had this conversation about rocks having consciousness, and then Biscuit was saying it's the aboutness, which was, I mean, was just strange. So there's a wide spectrum, right? And you could say, and you can, the other thing that I refer to is utopic paradigm. So let's say the most conscious entity we can imagine has all the sensory inputs that we can imagine. So take animals, all the wavelengths that you can imagine, and say, okay, the highest form of consciousness would be one which would bring together as much information from the environment, process it in a brain, in a very complex brain. Let's say take the brain from an octopus, from a dolphin, from an elephant, and from birds, and combine all the best qualities of that, and say, okay, we've got an amazing processing machine with inputs and outputs, right?
Hmm.
So that would be like the highest form of consciousness that we could, as humans, with the experience and the knowledge of the senses that we have studied, we could come up with, right? Um, and then we have the lowest form of consciousness, which, let's say just a living organism that there's nothing to process that information, but it's just exchanging chemicals and energy and somehow interacting with the environment. I wouldn't personally call that consciousness, but I'll grant that for the people who would. Um, I would probably start to call it consciousness as soon as you have a brain and sensory inputs, um, and probably a nervous system. Um, and then the other part of Ali's thoughts, where I would use the spectrum of things, would be what's innermost and what's outermost. How far away? How far can we reach, and how 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 the connections happen inside our brain, inside the collection of organs that the brain is, right? So you have um, the brain connecting to within itself, gathering information, releasing neurotransmitters, and then that brain, the different parts of the brain, connecting through the brainstem to the rest of the body through the nerves and the spinal cord.
Okay.
And then you have an even further projection, um, where your senses are connecting to your nervous system, and then you have your eyesight or your hearing, perhaps your sense of temperature. All these things that are kind of projecting your experience into the world outside, and that projection is inside of your brain. So the spectrum of things here are, what's the innermost and what's the outermost, and how far can we reach, and we can enhance these. And okay, so we'll say the most comprehensive one, to use another utopic paradigm, an ideal that doesn't exist, um, would be you know augmenting the human experience with cameras and whatever radar, whatever devices and telescopes and microscopes that can enhance our experience and take that consciousness further and further out into the cosmos or into the microcosmos, whatever. Um, and the the smallest one in the spectrum of things would probably be again something that connects immediately from inside to outside. It doesn't have many levels. Very basic bacteria or something like that.
So consciousness is, instead of looking at it like either something's conscious or it's not conscious, it might be better to look at things as on more of a spectrum, like some things are more conscious than other things, and then in addition to that, there's the spectrum of consciousness being on a spectrum of how local it is to a brain, where there's a spectrum of going from the brain and then out through the body and then even beyond that. Is that does that kind of sum up what you were saying?
I think so.
Yeah.
So,
So,
David, I'm sorry, please go ahead and finish.
oh no, go ahead. I have a quick question after you.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that through science we cannot discover something beyond the simple definition that I gave, and Alfonso beautifully kind of expanded on it. There could be something there we just don't quite understand. This, awareness, the consciousness, the immersion of thoughts, the quality of kind of construction in our head, and there are things to be, certainly, discovered and better understood through science and particularly neuroscience. So, we've just at the earliest stage of kind of tackling our understanding of how the brain works, not from the physiological perspective. I think we are able to map just about uh, every neuron and see what, if you do something to it, then what kind of output you get in terms of the physiological um, reaction to it, moving your finger and scratching your nose, whatever that might be. But trying to squeeze the consciousness out of this process, uh, it is uh, it is going to be an interesting task. So I just think probably we can make progress to a better understanding how this thing works in our head in terms of the concept of awareness and consciousness. So we'll see.
Yeah, it seems like, at least scientifically, we're just really starting to understand consciousness. Um, my question was, what's required for consciousness? What are the what yeah what are what's the criteria that is required for consciousness to be there?
Well, based on the definition that I give and Alfonso talked about, we're already there. I mean, there's nothing more is necessary. We are interacting with our outside inside world, and so we're there, and so are other animals. So, but once you go and take this consciousness to the Eastern philosophies, to supernatural, to moral systems, then that becomes an issue. The question that you're asking, and really, I'm not. I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah, like, is a brain required for consciousness to exist?
Oh,
Yeah, especially if you talk with spiritual people, that it just gets too too out there.
so David.
Yeah, would you say consciousness requires a brain?
David, there are just two school of thoughts. I mean, these are completely extreme. As you probably know, everybody here, but I'm just saying it for the conversation. One is, of course, the consciousness being the emerging property of the brain. That's stop. That's it. And then once we die, that this local consciousness. I don't even want to say local, because once you say local, it has an intimation that there is something else. Let's just call it emerging property of the brain, you die and off it goes. Then you've got the other end, which is, collective consciousness, and your brain being kind of the organ of local organ, which is connecting, interacting with this collective consciousness. And then, you just collaborate for a while, and then we die, and, the consciousness goes back to its kind of cloud of consciousness, collective consciousness. Those are kind of two kind of extreme, not extreme, actually, I believe in the first scenario that I just mentioned. And
Mhm.
so that's kind of those are the two kind of concepts. And but I think, as you see, the collective consciousness, it takes us to this supernatural kind of, or paranormal, whatever you want to call it, realm that I have a lot of difficulties getting there, and I don't see a need for it.
Mhm.
Um, there was a talk that Professor Lee Cronin. I don't know if you guys have come across him.
Mhm.
He's a scientist. He does some research, and he runs rooms with his colleagues. And he was very emphatic about how I used to use emergent property all the time because I thought it was a very good way of explaining things. And he was completely dismissive of the idea of emergence, or an emergent property. He said it was a little bit like a cop out. It was saying a lot without saying anything. Um, and I liked it, even though it was probably challenging me and a lot of people who use that, because you're going. It's a little bit like filling in. It's an emergent property. But emergent property doesn't actually define the thing. You have to actually say what it is. I don't know if you guys catch my drift. I'm going to look for that replay because I was fascinated by what he said.
When I think of emergent property, I think of wetness when you combine hydrogen and oxygen. Like, uh, wetness is an emergent property from those two elements when combined. Uh, and so, uh, I guess is that kind of what they were talking about as far as emergent properties go?
Um, can you repeat that? Sorry.
Um, yeah, when I think of emergent property, I think of wetness when you combine hydrogen and oxygen in a certain way to make water. Um, so like wetness is what emerges from combining the two elements. And when those elements are not combined, you don't have the property of wetness. So that's what causes it to emerge. Um, I guess I was just wondering what takeaways you got from that uh, or from them about emergent properties.
Yeah, basically what I gathered from it is, and I think it's the pin link. If you guys copy the link and watch it later, perhaps you'll catch my drift. I think it was towards the beginning of the room. If it's not this one, it's the next one on Professor Lee Cronin's profile. But what I gathered was so consciousness is the emerging property of the brain. What are you saying by that? That you have a brain and suddenly uh, consciousness emerges. Well, we should actually define what happens within the brain, understand the processes by which um, that idea of a conscious entity happens somewhere there. And I think it goes hand in hand with when people say we cannot explain consciousness. And it's we can and we can't, right? Because I think it goes a little bit along the lines of we have, when people say, you can think of a banana, but no matter how hard you scan a brain, you're not going to see a banana, which is kind of not true because they're starting to be able to image brains and get like at least blurry things out of it that are the image. But I might be getting lost in a rabbit hole. It's just the gap. Yeah, it's just filling in the gap between emergent property and what do you mean by consciousness. I don't know. It's yeah. I'll stop there.
I think I
Cool.
heard someone was saying, again, I'm paraphrasing if I can remember, consciousness is just the most obvious thing, the most simple thing appears to be, and the most mysterious thing, in a sense that we kind of have an intimation, we kind of know, in a sense, something, being conscious. But again, it's just such a mystery. At one point, I started to focus on this, and I said, okay, I just gonna learn as much as I can, for a while, and I really didn't follow up with it. I I listened to a couple of sessions that this guy called, I'm not pronouncing his name correctly, I think. Let me give it a try. Giulio Tononi, Tononi, on consciousness. He's been a professor. He's Italian, and pretty interesting culture. And he has his 5 basic premise in terms of his theory about this. Again, he's among probably, I don't know, maybe a good dozen or more people who actually are serious kind of scholars of but this guy's approach, of course, like I would say most scientists, is a scientific kind of and neurologically based instead of kind of anything supernatural type thing. But anyway, it's the most immediate thing that we kind of know at first hand, but it's just so mysterious.
I got a couple of ways to come at this if you want to hear it.
Sure.
I heard this, and I always like this definition. It's consciousness is the awareness of awareness, which I thought was pretty interesting. As everyone was speaking, I was contemplating what I see consciousness as, and I would say that consciousness is that in which all phenomena manifests. That's my definition of consciousness.
Have you guys heard of the feedback loop that Hofstadter talks about?
I've heard of feedback loops with this kind of in mind, but not that one in particular. Tell me about it.
So there's this book that we were, trying to get through on Clubhouse on one of the book clubs we tried to start. It's called Gödel Bach, and it's a bit of a long book, but it tries to explain consciousness with many metaphors and many like stories, and it basically the like if you read the back of the book where it I don't know what it's called, the summary
Yeah.
is basically that there's an adjective to the feedback loop that they use, and it basically says how muddy water how consciousness can emerge out of muddy water, basically through
Oh.
evolution. How these chemicals and these cells can turn into something that is conscious, that reflects on itself. The endless feedback loop or something like that.
Mm.
Because it's you're getting information from the outside of the world in many shapes or in forms, through your senses, through the food you eat, through amounts of oxygen, and perhaps any other gases, through your visual inputs, like I said, sensory inputs, and those are feeding into your brain, and your brain already has genetic and previous memories that is dealing with and with which it's interpreting the world around you, and then interacting with the world um, using that information. So that's what the feedback loop is. You're renovating and re-informing. Your brain is getting it's getting fed back information, and it's putting out information. So it's an infinite. It's the infinite loop. They call it the infinite something loop. I'm going to look it up. So that's a basic idea. It's just consciousness basically is that loop of you being aware, you getting information, and some of it is unconscious, some of it is conscious. And I would say that as long as it's conscious, I would call it consciousness. And as long as it's in the background and you're not aware of that awareness, like Jerry said, I would not really call that consciousness.
Yeah, it reminds me of uh, the kind of feedback loop example of when you turn a camera back onto its monitor, and so it creates this like infinite loop of its own seeing what it's projecting. So yeah, I think that that's similar to the infinite feedback loop that I'm familiar with.